For so long, no end in sight. A modern world which thought it made the rules, cut down to size by Mother Nature. Humbled and frightened by unimaginable pain. But now, a destination hoving into view.
For the first time since this wretched virus took hold, we can see a route out of the pandemic. The breakthroughs in treatment, in testing and vaccines mean that the scientific cavalry is now in sight. And we know in our hearts that next year we will succeed.
A tentative start on the journey will be made on the 2nd of December, when the current England-wide restrictions will be replaced by a beefed-up regional tiered system. Many more will be in the higher tiers. All areas in the highest tier will be given extra testing for 6 weeks, by which time a nationwide vaccination programme should be underway. And over Christmas, a careful relaxation of some rules.
I know that many of us want and need Christmas with our families. We feel after this year we deserve it. But this is not the moment to let the virus rip for the sake of Christmas parties. 'Tis the season to be jolly, but 'tis also the season to be jolly careful, especially with elderly relatives.
It felt at times today as if there were 2 Boris Johnsons appearing from his self-isolation lair here in Downing Street. Tonight, a highly cautious Prime Minister adopted a downbeat tone as he warned the country of a hard slog ahead. But earlier, a more boosterish Prime Minister was beamed into Parliament as he sought to reassure Conservative MPs who are highly sceptical of continuing restrictions. A former health minister sees slow moves towards a happier place.
This is about putting together the vaccine, the testing, and the improved test track and isolate to make sure that we can get safely through to the spring when hopefully through science we can achieve some sort of herd immunity. And I think that's the best hope that we've got right now. There are many, many forks left in the road, many bends. Many people feel like they're going round the bend. Many of us do in 2020, the year that just keeps on giving. But there is cautious signs for real optimism and hope.
Labour says it's important to be cautious.
Well, I think it's right that we give people hope because it's been a terrible year for everyone and we want some light at the end of the tunnel, but equally we can't afford to send the message out that the virus is beaten, because it certainly isn't, and we know it's going to be considerable amount of time, possibly 6 months or more, before everyone will be vaccinated, and that's really the point that we need to get to before we can be confident that we've actually got over this.
A leading scientist believes this may be one of science's finest hours.
Oh, but the whole scientific response to this pandemic has been quite extraordinary. I mean, the very fact that it was identified and sequenced within weeks of it becoming clinically apparent, all the way through to developing the diagnostics, and I mean, it's been difficult to roll them out, but the idea that you could go from an unknown infection to a sequenced virus to a diagnostic to a vaccine in this period is quite unprecedented. It wouldn't have been possible even 5 or 10 years ago.
A crisp feel to the air and reassuring sights on our streets. But still some way to go until normal life returns.
That was Nick Watt, and joining us now, Professor Sir John Bell, Regis Chair of Medicine at Oxford University, who sits on the UK Vaccines Task Force, and Lord Robert Winston, Labour peer and Professor of Science and Society at Imperial College London. It's great to have you both. Sir John, I'm going to start with you. It does feel like Oxford's day today, and the PM said this is our route out of the pandemic. Is that how you feel now?
Well, I, as you know, I'm quite optimistic that we'll get ourselves out of trouble sometime over the course of the next few months. I've made the prediction that it'll be spring before things start to appear to be normal again. And I think that's about the right timing. We've got 3 vaccines now. We've got mass testing, which appears to work pretty well. We've got a lot of arrows in the quiver that we can shoot. So I'm fairly optimistic that things will start to move in the right direction now.
Were you always optimistic, or am I right in thinking that you, at one point, you had doubts that you would ever get here?
Well, I wasn't sure we were going to get a vaccine, if you want to know the honest truth. I always put the odds of that at being 50%, because it's hard to make vaccines to respiratory pathogens. This was not a given. And the way things were bumping along at the beginning, it wasn't clear that the testing was going to go well. Therapies were hard to find. It was a bad time last spring, but I think now we've got reason to be optimistic.
Let me ask you to explain this, the 70% versus the 90% effectiveness, which I think a lot of people might be confused by. We've heard, you know, with Pfizer, with Moderna, the other vaccines, that there is a higher rate. Now, presumably, people won't be given a choice, will they, when the vaccine comes round? Or if you could choose between higher efficacy but lower side effects, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so just to be clear, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccines are terrific vaccines. They're a brand new platform, and I think the level of efficacy they've achieved is extraordinary and terrific. But the truth is, you don't need that kind of efficacy to have an effective vaccine. The flu vaccines run at about 60% efficacy. So, you know, you don't need to get there. And I think the most important thing about the vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, is that when we looked at people both with the low dose and the high dose, both the 70%, which is the high dose, and the 90%, which is the low dose, high dose, and we looked for people who developed severe disease, we didn't have any in either group. So it's highly effective at preventing people from being admitted to hospital with bad disease, which is what we intended to have in the first place. So we could have a theoretical argument about why one's better than the other, but the truth is they're both pretty good at doing what we want them to do.
Lord Winston, this looks like the bet has paid off. This is pretty much vindication of the whole strategy, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly a remarkable achievement, there's no doubt about that, and it's congratulations to Oxford and the other universities. I think one of the really interesting things is that this is one of the first times that we've seen it in recent years, and I can remember where the university has really, in fact, taken things right through to a product which is then actually capable of being used for healthcare. Usually this is done by big pharma and other companies, so this is amazing too for our academic sector. But I'm a bit concerned about the risk of hubris, about the risk of being optimistic. I think the problem is not that the scientists, I think the science is great, but I regret to say that when you look back over the last 8 or 9 months, the government has not really been trusted, and it still isn't trusted. It's interested in messaging, but it's not interested in communication. And I think that's a real problem, because so much of the time we're getting top-down messages which aren't really intelligible, and we've seen a series of debacles. For example, we've seen Test and Trace, which was a shambles. We've seen problems with healthcare workers being exposed unnecessarily to the virus and so on. And I think that's a real problem now, because there are a lot of young people who are really very, very sceptical and somewhat suspicious. And so we've got to do something about that, because of course... So
it's sceptical to the point where they wouldn't take the vaccine. Is that your fear?
Well, there are a lot of anti-vaxxers around. You only have to look at the social media to see that. That's a problem for a start. But I suppose one of the issues, of course, is that, you know, there's an ethical difference, as Sir John will tell you, between giving a vaccine from giving a normal drug. Because with a vaccine, you're treating a vast number of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even more. But of course, those are well people. They're not being treated for an illness that they've yet got. So there's a big issue. And we saw that with MMR, actually, to some extent.
That was a long time ago. We you know, history relates what happened there. Sir John, the PM said that this is never going to be mandatory. So do you have that same concern? How do you make people want it? I think the Australian airline Qantas has said, for example, it will be a necessity for flying with them. Is that how you do it? Do you make employers insist on it, head teachers insist on it?
So I'm very firmly against mandation. I think mandation is not a good way to bring people along with you. I mean, it works well in some societies, but it doesn't work well here, nor would it work in North America. So I think you do have to persuade people to come along. Having said that, we may get to a position where it's necessary in order to control transmission to know who's protected from developing the disease and who isn't. And that protection could come in one of two ways. One is you could have had the disease, and I think there's now increasing evidence that if you've had the disease and you've had a positive PCR test, then you are protected against the disease for a period of time. And I'll leave that open, but it's probably at least 6 months, probably a year. And then if you get a vaccine, you'll be protected against the disease. So it may be necessary for some activities to require people to be able to show that they are protected against the disease or have recently had a test in order for that to go back to relatively normal function. So I think all this has to play out. The big issues now relate really, and I think Lord Winston has hit the nail on the head. A lot of this is policy related now. It's how do you implement the best approach to getting this all across the finish line? The science has sort of done its job, but it can't operate on its own. It's got to operate in a policy framework.
So it's over to Professor of Science and Society, the behaviour and what that involves. How confident are you then that this rollout can be?
I don't. You call me a Labour peer. I mean, I do take the whip just about, but I must have to say to you that I do feel quite, I think, independently that the government has certainly overpromised and underperformed, and I think that's a big problem here, because of course, if we, I mean, it's inevitably you're going to get some people with worse side effects than others with any kind of medication, however simple, even aspirin. So the risk, of course, is that you then start to really create mistrust as the rumours go round. And I think that's a big problem because, of course, you can disturb a lot of people who are already very, very anxious about a highly puzzling disease which has so many different faces attacking so many different organs in different people.
I wonder what the answer to that is, though. I mean, you can't stop people talking about side effects if.
Of course we can't, and we shouldn't. That's the point. I don't think we should. But I think, what we can learn is from history. We've seen nuclear power was very badly handled because we lied about the risk of emissions, of radioactivity. With MMR, of course, we really didn't get the message across with the measles vaccine, and with foot and mouth and with BSE. With genetically modified crops is a wonderful example of a really good technology which we mishandled with very poor communication and also commercial interests in that particular case.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So I think we have to be aware that we've got to be really a bit more, we've got to be, not the scientists, I think everybody has to be modest and actually just be, I don't think that means, for example, we stop taking precautions simply because we've got a vaccine. And I think that's one of the issues we've got to think about.
And do you think, can I put the same thought to you, Sir John, when we're now talking about Christmas and what that might entail and the start of sort of opening up, getting a few families together and all the rest of it, we don't know the exact details yet, does that seem to you like running before we can walk, given that we're so close?
Well, I'm of the view that we've got to be pretty cautious for the next little while. It's going to be some time before we get a significant number of the population immunized. And you only have to look at how quickly this disease can spread to realize that we do have to try and keep the lid on this thing for a while longer. Yes. Now, having said that, the population, the people in this country have had a really, really terrible year. Really from February on, people have lost their jobs, they've had loved ones die, they've been locked up in their homes. They haven't been able to do the usual things that they do. I mean, it's been pretty awful. So my view is that loosening it up for a few days over Christmas will undoubtedly lead to a bit of an increase in the transmission of the disease. But I think there's a point at which you probably have to let it loose a bit in order to keep people going through till March or April.
OK. Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.